Now we'll go ahead and move over to our instruction set, where today we're going to be talking about, again, integrating UI Toolkit with Unity ECS. So Danny, I will leave it up to you to give us a little demo of your project that you're going to be showcasing, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, so here's the nice little project, and hopefully the zoom is all right today, because last time it was very tiny and a little blurry. I did zoom in stuff in this time. So we have this nice little scene. We can see some UI over here on the side. There's a whole terrain going on, procedurally generated even, which looks very nice. Some few different materials, some ore, some stone, some nectar, because these small little slime creatures that are in the game want that nectar. Anyways, if we actually go into what this little prototype can do, we notice that I have this debugging tool. This is simply for debugging that allows me to change the different material, and I can set all the different materials here, which is very nice. It's a grid-based game, so you can notice how there's like a corner here, and then that's where I'm setting the material, and then figures out what tiles to put. That's not really important for today's topic, but we might very well revisit this later, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this project, like for instance all of this for navigation. But yeah, so I'm able to press these UI buttons, and they switch the state of my mouse. Notice that when I'm here, I kind of have a mouse that targets every corner, because those are the corners I'm changing. But when I press here, I'm in selection mode, and I can move these slimes around. Theoretically speaking, I don't know why that wasn't working that well. There we go. And I can select multiples, and that's very nice. So yeah, I have this whole UI system going on, and it works very well. I made a few changes, so there's still some bugs here, but don't look at those. They're not there if you close your eyes or press this button. That's how to fix all bugs. Okay, so how did I implement this UI is a good question. If we look at this world over here, the actual subscene, it has a few things that make it work. So obviously the cursor was changing whenever we pressed any of the buttons. And also we had 6 buttons. But if we actually go and open up the UI, which the UI is here, is a UI document, and that's how UI Toolkit works. You create these UI documents. And in it, there's something called a UI XML file that explains how that UI looks. And this is actually the code underneath, but you can also use this handy little editor. You don't actually need to understand the code, even though it looks a lot like HTML. So if you know HTML, I think it's fine.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of the benefits that I've heard pitched about UI Toolkit, is that you can say, hire a designer who has a lot of like web design experience, and
Exactly.
they should be able to get up and running pretty quickly, be able to make a nice UI for your game. And it also does work for editor tooling, as far as I understand, right?
That is correct. And I mean, a lot of editor tooling is written in it today. I think all of the UI builder itself is also written in it, which is kind of funny.
It's dog fooding at its best.
Yeah, it is. And all of the entities paneling is also written in it. All of the like DOTS hierarchy and entity hierarchy and so on, entirely written. Anyways, if we look in here, there's this button called building, but there's this visual element called building buttons that says, hey, anything that you place under me, could you please put it in a downwards direction from the left side? And I've added another UXML, which actually has the button. So if we quickly open that up, that's how that looks. I guess I put it in the scene actually. Boom, boom. You can now see if I put a bunch of building buttons in here, they will sort of stack up if I actually put them at the right location, that is. So they will sort of stack up, which is very nice. So, okay, now we have all these buttons here, but you can also notice that if I don't do any changes, that's probably a good idea. We have a UI that we haven't even pressed play on, and it has all the buttons, but there's no actual buttons inside the UXML right now, which means something must be adding these buttons. And we'll get back to that in a second. But first I want to show a little bit more about the setup, so we don't get too far ahead of ourselves. If we look at the canvas itself, which is the data in the subscene, this just stores which document to draw. We have a reference to the canvas. Like this is a prefab version of the canvas. All it has is, it's a game object that has a UI document on it that has the source asset of, the UXML. So, okay, our canvas has a reference to that. And our building buttons are, there are 6 of them here, 0 to 5, so 6. And notice when I go and push them up and down, this is actually the image. Oh my god, okay, this is bright. But yeah, it is actually that image that I'm moving up and down. So I'm simply moving the sprites up and down here, and it knows then to update the UI. But that's very interesting because the actual UI is this object. If I were to do this, notice that I'm not drawing it anymore. And also it's not updating. Now it is, because anytime I press it, the editor will update it. And that comes to the code later. But if you look at the canvas, the last thing remaining is just a reference to the building button itself, because we want our baking workflow to prepare ourselves for having a system that not only spawns the game object called manage canvas that has the UI, it should also add in all the buttons, and it should, use this building button UXML to add in those buttons, and then assign using these sprites here. I guess last remaining piece, let's see, yeah, it's just this one, which is that we have a cursor, and the cursor is actually what determines what kind of action we can do in the game, and it has the corresponding images. But that will only become relevant way later when we actually look at how buttons interact with the ECS game. Now, I think a good place to start is just to see how will this work in an actual game, and then we can look later on why this thing here works, why the editor part of it works, because it is very nice being able to see stuff ahead of time, like the fact that I can see the whole procedural generated level in my editor before I even hit play. But that's a talk for another day. So I'll open up the code real quickly.
But is all that procedural generation, is that done with the UI toolkit stuff as well, or?
It is not. It is entirely just a system. And the very nice thing about this system is that I just wrote a matching square algorithm, and then I realized, hey, wouldn't it be nice if it showed up in the editor? And I add the world system filter attribute above it saying editor, and this shows up, and it works immediately.
Awesome. That's so cool.
Yeah, I think that's a talk for another day.
Yeah, that'll be for another time. Yeah.
Yeah, because there is some reason behind why that can work and how to set up your code so that just works. I think it's one of the great possibilities of ECS is the fact that we have editor systems, and editor systems can just be a normal player systems, and that those can, you can essentially create a whole procedurally generated game, and it still show a seeded run in the editor.
Yeah,
so
that's really cool.
Tweak little settings without even having hit play. Which I think Tobias should be using, but he isn't, which is a little sad. But anyways,
I think what should be using that?
Tobias.
Oh yeah, for sure. We need to get him on that.
Yeah. No. Anyways, he has a procedural generated game for those that don't.
Wish list in the description below.
Ooh. Nice little plug there. Okay, I think we should just look at the little authoring part of it first. So we had our canvas author, which was the one that had the UI document on it, which is the prefab with the canvas on it. Then there's all the sprites of the building buttons, and then there's the visual tree asset, which is the UXML document that we want to instantiate a bunch of times, assigning all these sprites. And so what I'm doing here is just I'm putting it on a managed component.
Could you zoom in on the code just a little bit there too?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Yep, there we go. But yeah, so I'm assigning all of this to a managed component called canvas document reference. So we should expect some system to be able to query for a canvas document reference to get all of this data. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much all we need to know right now. Let's try to break down how the canvas system actually works. One of the first things it does is it just also this I can see is a remnant of old code. I don't think it actually needs to do this part anymore. But anyways, the important part comes up here. There we go. Yeah, so we have the system called the canvas setup system. And let's just not read any of the editor parts yet. So anytime that you see that it says anything about editor, just close your eyes. We're not going to talk about it yet. Because it is a little more nifty. That's also why I've wrapped it in some #if statements. So we can't see it yet. So right now we should just think of the system as something that, and also it is not needed. You don't need all of the editor code logic. That is just to have it also show up nicely when we don't press play.
Right.
Like this code still works without it. It just wouldn't work, be displayable. But yeah, okay, so this system is just waiting for this to happen. And the reason we want to wait for it to happen, and this is very important, is that anytime we're working with a subscene, we need to do this waiting, because otherwise you're going to end up in a scenario where you make a build and now it does asynchronous loading, and so it it takes some time. You can't just expect the first frame to have it ready, because that is what I'm expecting here. When I'm saying get singleton canvas document reference, I'm expecting it to just be there. So that would be pretty bad if it did that on the first frame. So by doing this, I will have it wait till the subscene has actually loaded it in. Okay, so now I finally have, the unspawned game object. The game object is not there. Like this is only for the editor, by the way. I should probably have called it that. You should just imagine at runtime, as soon as I press play, there is no managed canvas. And the reason you, by the way, should do that also is if you look at managed canvas here, it has this thing called destroy game object on awake.
Destroy goon awake.
I like my little. I was actually regretting it as soon as I wrote it, but I just needed something quick. So yeah, this just makes sure that it destroys it on awake, which means this is quite literally invalid any other time than in edit mode. So yeah, it does mean that we want to spawn it. We don't have a game object, so we want to spawn it, because the only way that a UI could work ever is that we need to spawn it. And the reason I'm doing this is there's a few ways that you can think about doing game object ECS interrupt, at least the way that I think of it. One of them is that you can have your game object be the one responsible for pinging out an entity saying, hey, now I've spawned this entity. But it also does mean that your game object has to find the correct world, which is annoying to do if you have a multiplayer game. And also, if you are dependent on any update ordering, you've probably done something wrong. So a lot of the time, it can be a lot easier if you just do the reverse. You don't have the game object at all. And this is the other approach you can do to any game object ECS interrupt. You don't have the game object at all. You just spawn it as soon as you press play. And you just need to store a reference to it instead. So anyways, that's what I'm doing. Again, we're not going to explain this part. The one thing I will say is that when we are in play mode, I expect to only run on update once. And therefore I'm, saying state.enabled directly as to make sure that it doesn't run again. On update will never be called a second time when we hit play. But yeah, okay. So in play mode, we'll have the document be the instantiated version of that prefab that we stored. And we need to get the UI document because this is just a game object that we stored. We note that earlier in our canvas author, which is here, what we actually stored was not the UI document. We stored the UI document's game object. So that's just one important thing to note. It's because there's a few bugs sometimes if you save a game object as a UI document directly, as a Unity engine component directly. But yeah, so we are spawning that canvas. We are getting the mono behavior called UI document so that we can, make changes to it. Because we now want to go and find building buttons. The thing we saw earlier where we can add a bunch of building buttons to it. Yeah, and we want to make sure it's clear, which is very nonsensical if you look at the code just in runtime fashion. But yeah, it's there. So we ensure there's no buttons to begin with, because we want to add all the buttons ourselves. And where are the buttons stored? We remember we already have an array of all the sprites. So let's just loop through all the sprites and then instantiate a new button. And this is the way that you in UI Toolkit can instantiate a new button. You just get the visual element asset and say .instantiate to spawn a new button, and then you get a template container as a return, which is, it's not yet a part of anything. It's not put in any visual tree yet.
It's kind of just like a prefab almost, right?
Exactly, but usually if you instantiate a prefab, you would expect it to show in the scene. But this is more like a game object prefab where it doesn't show up in the scene, but it just has a prefab component almost. So it's not part of anything. So we are going to add it later, but that's just one thing to keep in mind. Right now, the first thing we want to do is make sure that our template is set correctly up for the given sprite that we're currently iterating over. So if we actually look at our template, if we go back in here, scroll to the button, we have the building button here, and we look at how it's set up. Well, any building button is going to contain something underneath it, which is an icon, and that has a background, which can be a sprite. Something very nice about the UI Toolkit is also the fact that I can pre-visualize it. It's already there. We can see it right now. So I can fake change it in here to something else, and we would sort of get an idea of how it looks. By the way, I will also have to note, all of this works really well with UI Toolkit. It's a lot harder to do this whole setup with the old UI system. But I think we'll get to that later when it comes to multiple entities and multiple game objects wanting to have a reference between each other, like what you would have to do for an animator, because you might have an army. But anyways, so we instantiate the building button, we get the icon, it's part of the style, because it's part of the style in here. Icon is under the big thing here called style. And then it's a section called background, where there's something called image. So therefore, it's a background image. It's almost like, when you do game objects, you go oh, I need to get component this game object, and then do the individual thing. So yeah, okay, we set the style background, and you can just, in style, when you say new style background, you can pass in anything that is equivalent to an image. So a texture would also work, a render texture would also work, but we're just passing it a sprite. And this also only works if you have the sprite package, like a sprite editor. As there's a specific package you need, but it's part of the default 2D options. But yeah, okay. So now we set up the button correctly. So now we have a button. We haven't added it to the actual canvas that we have in our scene yet, that we spawned earlier. That we do down here. We just say building buttons, which we got earlier, .add, give me this template, and put it in. Okay, so now I also skipped ahead a little, because there's this code in between, and that is what I do in order to actually make the button pressing work. If I don't have this code, what I would now have is I would have a canvas that just spawned, and it would show all the buttons, but it wouldn't do anything.
Right.
But it would very nicely show up. They would just be nonsensical buttons. So what I'm going to do here is another thing. And normally we kind of discourage lambdas. And one of the reasons that we, by the way, do that is because lambdas, you get into a hard-to-know debuggable state where you don't know when something is going to happen in an update loop. It might happen at any time. Could you answer right now? when in your update loop the UI system will call this event. I can't do that, and I work.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I would. Yeah. I
And
would have some guesses, but I don't know.
exactly, but that kind of works counter to any sort of like normal data-oriented lifestyle where you want to know what is happening, or at least have the ability to know. And this just straight up removes that ability. So you want to be able to minimize it. And if you notice, there's actually not a lot of code in here, so I have minimized it. And in a lot of cases, you can minimize it because what you can do is you can pass values into a lambda, totally fine. And because you can do that, it also means that you can actually pass in the entity manager or an entity query or any sort of thing, because I'm already, in a system, so therefore I'm in a context where I already have the world provided to me, so I can just, do a classic lambda capture to get it into that function. And so, clicking a button might as well add a entity to the world that a separate system could look at. So you can very quickly pull out and still get your predictability by simply minimizing the amount of things you do inside the lambda. So that's generally my advice. That's the approach I take. For debugging purposes, I will normally also break that rule. Like to anything I say here, there is an opposite rule that counteracts it. But generally speaking, you want to minimize the stuff you put inside a lambda. Just spawn in a separate entity. But this is, a small enough action that I can do it in my lambda. So what am I actually doing? Well, when I press a button, all I'm gonna do is, we have this query here looking for a cursor selection, and I want read-write access to it. Because here's the thing. If we go to our game, we look at the cursor. The cursor on it has a component called cursor selection, which stores the current state, right? It says, okay, now we're in destroy mode. Now we are in destroy mode on top of an object. Now we're in select mode on top of an object. Yada yada. And there's a unique
whatever action your cursor would do when you click, you're kind of storing that just like in an enum.
Exactly. And that's the approach, a specific approach I've taken here, just to simplify it a lot. You could just spawn a game object, or you could have set any other state here, right?
Sure.
But like setting something as simple as an enum in your button clicking ability means you can poll it later and do any sort of other operation you want. So that's what I've done. There's only one cursor, so it is a singleton, and therefore I can just, pass in an entity query. Also note that I couldn't just have done system API .get singleton RW here, which, by the way, I'm a little sad
because it's in a lambda. That's why.
Exactly. I'm also a little sad. Oh wait, no. Is it saying? No, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's saying a dumb issue, and we probably should have a better error than this, because this is not a good error.
Yeah. Right.
It basically complains that our source gen is wrong. It does at least say the correct line. It says 107, which also happens to be this line. So it does correctly say that there's something wrong here. Anyways, the reason that can't work is because while it is inside of a valid, system API context in the regards of the function itself, because it's a function that contains a system state, it being in a lambda also means that it's, a separate class. A lambda is a captured, separate generated class to anyone that has seen a lowered down version of the syntax. And a hot little tip, when I do want to see why stuff like this is failing, if you have writer, this sadly only works in writer. You can just do dots, show generated code, and then we can see why it doesn't work. We can see that it tries to pass in this query, but that this query is on part of this type here. And so it wouldn't work because it's a local variable, and local variables can't just be captured in a lambda. But yeah, also this is a very quick way to get a better understanding of how our more lower API works. is one of the ways that I generally always recommend if you want to learn a more advanced API, is just to write a simple piece of system API code and see what it generates in here, which is very nice. And also, we should probably mention this in a later video, but there is a attribute you can add that puts it in a folder, so all Visual Studio people can still have something to look at, because it doesn't work in Visual Studio.
Yeah, being able to view that generated code is helpful.
Yeah, and it's especially also helpful for debugging. Being able to view what code is actually being run is very nice. And also, you can take that generated code and just plug it into your actual code and then see what fails there. Now that you have that version where it's broken up, maybe one function in system API turned into 4 functions. Now you can just pick apart and say, hey, I don't need the third one in here of the 4. But anyways, so I pass in entity query because an entity query still has the ability to do get singleton RW, and that's why this works. If I wanted to, if I couldn't express it as a singleton, a way that I could, do it to a specific entity is simply by passing in an entity and passing in a component lookup, and that could also have worked. I could have done as system API get component lookup here, and I could have done a entity, stored those, put it, and then captured them in Lambda. If I wanted, to do it on a specific entity. But yeah, so now I have a button that has the correctly set up Lambda expression, because what it will do is, based on which I we currently have, so whether it's the 0th button, 1st button, 2nd button, etc., it will say, hey, for button 0, you should be it should do the default thing, so therefore it should be the letter outline plus I. So for 0, it would be the letter outline. For 1, it would be the... What else do we have? I think I'm in insert mode. There you go. It would be workshop outline, and for 2, it would be stockpile, because it's letter outline plus 2. Yeah. And for 3, it would be destroy default. It would be select default. For 4 and for 5, it would be draw default. So button number 5 will always be setting the cursor action as you should draw. And that's, what I'm capturing here. So that's kind of my way of having each button have their own action to do. And yeah, and then, you go to the next button and you keep doing that. And that's very nice. Now you have at runtime, this is all you need in order to create a bunch of buttons that you can press, and they will, change every time you press a button. They will just change the value on the cursor, therefore allowing to have a responsive UI with all the buttons just added in, and it does all of that at runtime. Yeah, actually, Johnny, just to test it out, your understanding, could you give a quick summary of what it would do at runtime? As soon as I hit play, what happens?
So what happens at runtime, you mean?
As soon as I hit play, yeah, what happens? And that is what happens in order to make it so that when pressing this button, I'm able to be in this cursor mode.
That was where you were using that switch statement, correct?
Yeah, but before that happens.
You mean to initialize all that?
Yeah.
Was that in the Lambda?
I'm talking even before that. I want to first, see the canvas.
So that was when it kind of initialized. You referenced basically that game object that got destroyed, and then you kind of spawned those essentially prefabs, right? Like the kind of UI.
Yeah. But also, I don't actually reference the one that got destroyed, because that wouldn't work. It got destroyed. Yeah, so in quick summary, what I'm doing is, if this kind of annoys the understanding a little, let's not do that for a second. Just gonna quickly remove the editor stuff. At least enough of it that it won't fail to do this. So notice now that we don't actually even have the canvas here in the scene. Yeah. Which also means we don't have a preview of it anymore. But when I now go to press play, the UI still works. And the reason for it is as soon as we hit play, we spawn the game object. We had a reference to the prefab because our UI is just a prefab down here. And that is then what we spawn and set up correctly. Okay. And in order to set up it correctly, then that's why we need all the, set the create instantiate a new button and set that on the UI canvas, and then set up the lambda so that anytime you press a button, it will match an operation done in the entity world. But yeah, you can see here, as soon as I hit play, I spawn this managed object, and it's not actually part of the subscene. It's just outside of the subscene.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, and then the final part is just, why am I able to see it in the editor so nicely, and why does it update? Which luckily it shouldn't, is not that much edit code. The thing about when you hit play mode is what actually happens when you hit play mode is we destroy the editor world, and then we create the other world, which is the default runtime world. So as soon as we hit play, destroy editor, create play mode, and we do that in reverse when we exit play mode, which also means that we have access to this editor world that we can keep making changes to. Like for instance, when the editor world is running, hey, could you please just find a reference to a valid canvas where we can do the same operations, and just update that instead. And so that's what I'm doing here. So it sticks around. It's just always here in the editor. It's only when I hit play that it will be gone. And the reason for it being gone and the way that this object was created is simply I took the prefab, yoinked it back up here, and added this component on it.
Right.
Which had, a destroy call in its awake. I think most people that, are here can write this piece of code. But yeah, so now we have this little nice object, and we can, get a reference to it. One way to get a reference is obviously you can use the classic weird game object singleton sort of pattern. You could also have the game object itself in its awake call. Make sure to set a reference on a system or create an entity that keeps that, valid reference around.
You're basically just deciding to have a prefab there to begin with that you destroy when you hit play. And then when you hit play, then you also just go ahead and spawn that prefab because you have a reference to it.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, I don't need to change much code in order to fit the editor workflow. I already created the runtime version and then added some tiny changes to it in order to fit it also looking nice up in the editor. And sometimes you don't even have to do that. But in this case, I did. So what I did in order to make it look nice in the editor is that, in our... actually, I don't even need this part initially. Boom. Well, for starters, I need the world system filter, which is what makes sure that on create and on update is run in the editor world. So it will still go through the same process. And the reason that it might not necessarily work the same process is that while it would be able to find canvas document reference because the editor world 2 has access to any subscene data, it will so therefore this will work perfectly fine. It will have to find a different UI document because we don't want it to spawn that game object because it might not be easy to correctly destroy. So instead what we do is we here when we try to get the document, we ask, hey, is this current system that we're running an editor system? And if so, we should just do find object of type. It might be a slower call, but it's run so rarely that
you're running it in the editor, so
Yeah, and the editor update doesn't actually happen every frame. It happens every editor loop,
Right.
every editor frame. So whenever you
And
do like any,
yeah, if you're
value
like
change or any
dragging values or moving the scene view around, but if you're not doing anything, then it doesn't update
update,
or
yeah,
anything. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So in the case that I'm in the editor, I just get that, and otherwise it takes all the same path, and that's why it works. Now there's one thing I'm doing for sort of an optimization purpose, which is all the rest of the editor code you see in here, which, for instance, is stuff like here where here I'm saying in onCreate, hey, could you please create a singleton on the system to store an old version of the canvas, the previous version of the canvas. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can check, hey, have I already updated this canvas before? In which case I don't need to add all the buttons again. And so, okay, I'm checking when I'm an editor version of it. I'm getting the singleton. I'm then asking, hey, is the last document that you saw the same one as the current one? If that is the case, then we should just return. Otherwise, we should, use the we should Otherwise, we should just set the last document and then we should do all the changes, because it means that we now have needs to modify and create everything from scratch. And by the way, this is also why we need to do this clear operation, because the document you get here might be one that was already created at some point.
Had some things in it already. Yeah.
Yeah. And generally, it's fine to keep it around for runtime part, because this is probably a cheap operation.
Right.
Especially if that's list is already 0, it should be a no up at that point. But yeah, I'm just getting the reference. There is some difficulties around the equal stuff, which is I'm setting up a hash code, make sure that I have a proper hash code of the specific arrays and such. But that is just so that I have a proper way of comparing a previous canvas document to a current one, based on if you were to flip around the sprites. And that's the reason that when I move a sprite around, the hash code would change, and therefore the equals would now be false, and so it knows that it needs to update the UI. It needs to flip the buttons around. And that's actually all of the code I wanted to show, because I think there's going to be a lot of questions.
Nice, yeah. And yeah, once again, the code is available on our GitHub here. I can go ahead and post a link into the chat again and make sure I'll have that in the description for people watching the replay. So yeah, now we can go ahead and open it up to Q&A, where we have the buffer here. Did see a couple comments come through that I wanted to just highlight real quick. So this was in regards to, looks like ITR originally wanted to use UI Toolkit since the UGUI is painful to use, but we ended up having to switch because it would require a lot more work when implementing fancier UI. And one example they give is, for example, there was no smooth alpha mask. Anything that is not a simple animation felt like it didn't mesh nice with the class system. So yeah, it is kind of unfortunate. There are some things that in the UI toolkit that are not quite easy to use yet, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if it works in runtime, but at the very least I know it works in editor code. You can actually use GUI code in your actual editor UI toolkit editor windows, so you can early out in that way. But because some games will have to have something that updates a lot, like a mini map in a game. That one will have to rotate according to the map. It will have to have a bunch of waypoints. It might have, like, a lot of it is dynamic stuff that
Right,
wouldn't make
totally,
sense for a UI designer to set up, and it might make more sense for just a simple GUI representation of it, which allows for these like more smooth transitions, smooth simple animations, etc. I do, last I recall, and don't quote me on this. Again, this is not officially, affiliated with Unity, but I do remember seeing somewhere that they were looking at like having something like CSS animations, so just simple transitional like when you press this button, it will do a whoop whoop sort of thing.
Yeah, that would be super nice to have. Yeah.
And another tip that I would also give is just sometimes it's a lot simpler, at least for animation purposes, to use the what's it called, like absolute precision, and just have your code move stuff around yourself. That works very nicely.
Right. Yeah. I had actually done that stuff kind of way back when I was started, like pretty new with Unity. I was just doing a lot of that stuff kind of manually with the regular Unity UI, just kind of using coroutines or something like that to manually just make little animations happen and stuff. I see Tobias joined us. I think this was in reference to when we were saying that we should get him to have like editor generation for editor systems running for his procedural generation.
But what reason is he then giving for why it should why he shouldn't do it?
Let's hear your defense a little bit, or maybe next time you're on the show we can talk it. But he says he has editor generation, just not like that.
I remember seeing the code. I think there is a way. I just think it's you've put yourself in a path where it's going to be a long way. Yeah, it's excellent.
Because it's through Xcode. And by Xcode, he means
I think my main point is just that it is possible, but you have to think of it in the beginning of your project, because it means that you have to set up your runtime systems in a way that also allows for them being an editor system.
It also looks like it didn't exist when he originally did it.
I wonder which part. Yeah, well, 2020 is a long time ago. That's 4 years.
Yeah, I'd say. Another comment from ITR here reminds me of the error when the query doesn't match the job. Would be super useful to know what doesn't match, since that's not often easy to spot. Yeah, that makes sense. Just kind of giving a little bit of extra helpful context.
Well, I think one of the reasons that we don't do that is because it's going to be very expensive to compute which one is actually the one causing the issue.
Like you have to kind of do some like code analysis in that case.
Yeah. I guess we did talk about it at some point, but it was going to be very expensive to figure out. For a while, we didn't even want to add some detection.
Though for some stuff like reusing builders without resetting it should just error when you try to reuse those instead.
How would it error?
It's a good question.
What would it know that is wrong in that case? Is like, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. Entity Query Builder has a flag that's set when you use get entity query on it. Like,
Oh, by the way, looking at this question, I would not recommend using get entity query because it generally isn't burstable. But anyways, as a side point, use get query.
And if you try to add additional constraints, it gets into a corrupt state.
I wonder which flag you're talking about.
Yeah, might be.
I would have to see some code on that. That's
look into a little bit more.
Very interesting. Any more questions?
Yeah, do we have any more questions on anything related to some of the UI Toolkit stuff that Danny was showcasing? Any other things that you might want to see for future episodes in relation to any UI stuff? Because I know this is probably a topic that we'll revisit at some point. Is finalized?
I'm not sure what that is. 1 second.
Yeah, and yeah. Feel free to go ahead and post it in the our Discord after this. Yeah, you can just. Yeah, and anyone, of course, can join our Discord over at tmg.dev/discord. And yeah. only in UI. Well, so I was just kind of asking, if anyone else has any questions related to any of the things that we're showing, or if there's, suggestions for future topics related to UI, just because that was kind of something that we're talking about here today. But we're always open to hear any suggestions for general topics that you'd like to be interested in as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll just give it another quick sec for anything else on UI. But yeah, thanks for giving us the little overview about stuff with the UI toolkit. It's something that I've kind of experimented around with a little bit myself. Is something that I would like to use more, and especially being able to use it for editor tooling. I know there's definitely a lot of cool things and nice features that you can use there. So yeah, it's again, another one of those Unity features that I would like to use more. And yeah, hopefully it continues to get good support and we can start seeing some of those like, CSS based animations or other things of that nature too.
Yeah.